Hey, what's up? It's Brandon. I know I've kinda established myself as the melee guy on this channel, but I've got a little bit of a secret. The truth is, I actually really enjoy 2D fighters as well. I got into competitive fighting games in 2012, and while I didn't go to any tournaments back then due to the unfortunate combination of being a literal child at the time and living in a town with a scene so fucking tiny that our 20-man melee locals dwarfed it, I still watched EVO in 2012 and found myself hooked ever since. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm definitely more of a melee player. I've played so much melee that I literally flunked out of college. But as I was learning the game while dipping my toes in the various waters of other fighting games, a lot of my melee player friends would ask me what the appeal was. In fact, a lot of melee players in general don't really seem to see the appeal of 2D fighters, which is sad because I think there's a lot to unpack, and I think there's a lot of fighting games that are very similar to melee. So I figured I'd be a little tour guide, like Universal Studios, just the guy who drives the car around and shows you all the cool stuff. Before we begin, if I get any little details wrong, please don't be mean in the comments, and don't get mad at me on Twitter, man. I'm just a smasher that likes Street Fighter and Guilty Gear, dog. Also, subscribe, because most of you haven't yet, and I think that's pretty cringe. Anyways, let's talk about the basics. I think melee is like a game of tag. Depending on the matchup, offense and defense is constantly in flux, and as such the game is less about the moment-to-moment interactions and more centered around outmaneuvering your opponent and capitalizing heavily off of single interactions. The strength of the characters are strongly affected by their overall mobility, and you have a higher degree of control over your character. This lets you dictate the pace of the match in pretty much any way you want, to the point where you literally do not have to fight if you don't feel like it.
Should have listened.
Oh, he's done. He's done.
Probably no fist bump.
On the flip side, versus more aggressive players, you pretty much explode when you get touched. This, combined with melee's overall speed, turns the game into a frantic hellscape where both players are constantly moving around each other, looking for that one moment to turn the game upside down. In other words, if you either catch your opponent or can't be caught by your opponent, you win the game.
Oh, but you cannot give that kind of vantage point to Luke Stone.
Meanwhile, fighting games are, I really don't want to say they're like chess, because that's really cringe, so I'm not going to say it, but they're more methodical. Every game, even the faster ones, are all about the moment-to-moment interactions. This is because, obviously, the objective is different. The goal here is to beat your opponent to death, rather than throw them off the stage and prevent them from coming back. There's no platforms, there's rarely ever stage hazards, and the edges of the screen are literally walls. You're fucking boxed in, my guy, you have to fight.
I didn't sign up for a cage match.
To put it another way, because the only win condition in melee is to knock your opponent off of the stage, you can overlook a lot of the minutia as long as you accomplish that goal. Getting hit here and there, or losing a slight positional advantage, isn't really important in the grand scheme of things. However, in a more traditional fighter, you have a static amount of health, meaning the single interactions matter significantly more because every hit counts.
Gotta get in the beam. Oh, double KO! It's gonna go on to another round.
You're still moving around your opponent, but you're either throwing out a lot more quick moves to prevent your opponent from moving and setting up their game plan comfortably, or you're looking for opportunities to punish your opponent's commitments for big damage. In a lot of situations, you may know the frame data of the move you just threw out, and because you're plus and they're not, you can push your advantage a bit and begin to pressure your opponent. Maybe you know your opponent is going to throw out a slower move, and you decide to interrupt it with a slightly faster move that interrupts or counter hits your opponent's move, leading to a combo. Or maybe you throw out a move that hits harder and is a bit slower, but it's not plus and your opponent blocks it and punishes you. And while you can't literally fall off the stage, being trapped in the corner is far more devastating and is pretty much the end of the round if you can't fight your way out, due to how much more limited your movement options are. Not to mention that the only way to block is to hold back, meaning that if you're stuck in a bad spot, your whole goal is to try and move forward at all, let alone get out of the corner. Some games, such as Guilty Gear Strive, mitigate this by having corner pressure and damage eventually lead to the wall literally breaking and forcing you and your opponent to reset to neutral. Unlike Melee, however, simply landing a hit isn't enough to start your offense properly, and this is where I think things really diverge between the two kinds of fighting game. In Melee, nearly every hit or grab is an explosion. Part of being good at Melee is learning how to convert small openings to kills as consistently as possible, and due to percentage always having an effect on knockback and hit stun, except when it doesn't, moves that may not net you much at low percent can become incredibly powerful at high percent. Contrast this to a fighting game, hit stun, knockback, all that stuff is completely static. The purpose of a move or the reward you get from landing that move doesn't really change based on how much damage the opponent has taken. Rather, it changes based on the amount of resources you have at your disposal. Maybe you're playing Street Fighter and the move you landed is a good activation point for you to pop V trigger and push your advantage. Maybe you're playing Guilty Gear and you have enough meter to RC during your combo for an extension after it normally would have ended, netting you big damage and a wall break. Even then, it's pretty unlikely that you'll land a combo that straight up ends the round, and that leads into the next thing I wanted to talk about. Combos are a little bit different than in Melee. As I said before, in Melee, nearly every hit or grab is an explosion. Simply clipping your opponent and knocking them down or getting them to clam up so you can grab them is enough to get your freak on. And in Melee, combos hit hard. Against players with a solid punish game, getting comboed is usually death in Melee. To top it off, due to the higher degree of control over your character you have, there's a much heavier emphasis on freestyling your combos since you have to take into account things such as stage positioning, platforms, varying fall speeds, weights, and tech roll timings and lengths. Not to mention mechanics like DI and SDI that allow the player being hit to alter the launch trajectory and starting point of the move they just got hit by in real time.
Oh no,
Ooh,
nice up air. He's back.
What?
Wait, no fucking
He
way.
just smashed the eye onto
You
Battlefield.
can't do that. You can't.
On top of that, you always have the option to forego a longer combo to try and hit your opponent off stage early for a quick kill. The point is that combos are just one of the many ways you can net a kill in Melee, and sometimes if you notice your opponent is asleep at the wheel, it's better and easier to just throw your opponent off the stage and snipe their jump for a freebie. In a traditional fighter, you don't really have that option most of the time. A common misconception I've heard from other smashers is that in a fighting game, you just want to try and fish for your best or most damaging combo, but it's really not that simple either. Just because you can't control your character like you can in Melee, doesn't mean you don't have a ton of things to take into account when you're doing combos or running your offense. In actuality, there is a strong freestyle element to combos in traditional fighters. The kinds of combos you're trying to pull off vary based on what move you start the combo with, how much meter you have, where you are in the screen, whether your opponent was in the air when they got hit or the ground, etc. Also, the big damage combos are usually just really fucking hard, man. Combos also serve more purposes in fighting games than just big damage. A common example is that in many games, you may have a situation where it's better to go for a combo that has better screen carry or meter gain instead of damage. Alternatively, you may remember that I said that being in the corner was, pretty bad. In some instances, you may want to forego damage to sideswap, get yourself out of the corner, and put your opponent into the corner. In many cases, a lot of your character's moves may not even lead into combos at all, though this depends on the game. Games with a heavier emphasis on Gatling strings give you more chances to convert small openings to damage since you can cancel normals into each other with relative ease. Contrast this with a game like Street Fighter, which is more about slowly and methodically maintaining your spacing and chipping away at your opponent's defense, with very few opportunities to start a combo unless you're punishing your opponent for making a mistake. If you couldn't tell, this is just something that varies between different games. Some games you may not see long damaging combos very often, and then there's Marvel.
Oh, wait a minute. With his good oho, with his one good oho.
With the one.
Woo!
Lancecrafter, bitch. Lancecrafter, bitch. No.
Hit him with the on the incoming. He's gonna do it again. Oh! That was genius. That was genius. Stop. Cut
Take him
that
to
shit.
the other dimension.
No, that shit was
Chaos.
genius.
Dimension.
That shit was genius.
Just depends. If combos are what draw you to a game, you may want to take a stop in the anime and the versus fighter aisles before looking at more mainstream titles. So, yeah, fighting games are cool. If you're feeling frisky after a bad day of unranked grinding, give a traditional fighter a shot. Personally, for Melee players, I'd recommend starting with either Guilty Gear or Tekken. Guilty Gear has had quite a few bangers over the years, but the ones people play the most are Plus R and Strive. Plus R is probably closer to Melee in terms of game speed, fluid movement, and just goddamn fucking wacky shit constantly happening, but Strive is much newer, much more populated, and is a much easier game to learn for newcomers. It's also worth stating that both of these games have amazing netcode. Tekken is not that by any means, but in exchange for having almost no real in-game learning tools and bad online, you get a game centered around strong movement that is so incredibly deep and so fun to learn. So, give some fighting games a shot. You'll be glad you did. That's it for this video. If you enjoyed it, go ahead and drop a like and subscribe. If you like the sound of my voice, follow me on Twitter and check out the last episode of Melee Mechanics, where I go over basic movement options in Melee, along with real-world examples of how to apply them.